The October wind swept through the Oregon valleys like a harbinger of the trouble coming to Cedar Falls, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of rain. But Thomas Mitchell wasn't thinking about weather as he crouched behind the old oak tree on Widow's Ridge, watching a scene unfold below that would change his life forever. At 25, Thomas was the kind of man most folks overlooked, a surveyor from back east who'd come to Oregon Territory to map the expanding railroad routes, quiet and methodical in his work, keeping to himself in the boarding house on Main Street. He had learned long ago that anonymous men lived longer and safer lives than those who drew too much attention. But sometimes, a man found himself in the wrong place at the right time to witness something that couldn't be ignored. "You sure about this, Sheriff?" The voice carried clearly across the small clearing, where 4 mounted men had gathered under cover of the tall pines. Thomas recognized Sheriff Bradley's gruff tones immediately. The man had been the law in Cedar Falls for 8 years, respected by most, feared by some, and apparently corrupt beyond anyone's imagination. "I'm sure," Bradley replied, dismounting from his horse to join the other 3 men around a crude wooden table they'd set up in the wilderness. "The railroad survey shows the new line running right through the Henderson farm and the Morrison place. Once we convince them to sell, we split the profits 4 ways." Thomas felt his blood run cold as he watched the sheriff spread out official-looking documents on the makeshift table. He'd seen those same survey maps in the railroad office just last week. They were forgeries, showing a route that would never be built, designed to trick honest farmers into selling their land for a fraction of its true value. "What if they won't sell?" asked a thin man Thomas didn't recognize, though his expensive clothes marked him as someone with money and influence. "Then we make them want to sell," Bradley answered with a cold laugh. "A few cattle go missing, maybe a barn catches fire, crops get mysteriously destroyed. People get the message pretty quick." The 4th man at the table, Thomas could see now it was Judge Morrison, the territorial magistrate who was supposed to be above such corruption, pulled a leather pouch from his saddlebags. "Here's the first payment," Morrison said, counting out gold coins onto the table. "There's more where that came from once we get the Henderson farm. That land is worth 10 times what we're offering, once the real railroad route is announced." Thomas realized he was witnessing a conspiracy that would destroy the lives of dozens of honest farming families. The Henderson farm alone had been in the family for 2 generations, worked by a man who'd lost 2 sons in the Civil War, and was barely scraping by with his remaining boy. He started to ease away from the tree, hoping to escape unnoticed and figure out what to do with this terrible knowledge. But as he shifted his weight, his boot came down on a dry branch with a crack that echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. All 4 men spun toward the sound, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. "Someone's watching," Bradley hissed, his eyes scanning the tree line where Thomas had hidden. Thomas pressed himself against the oak's trunk, hoping desperately that the gathering shadows would conceal him. But his heart sank as he heard footsteps approaching, the soft jingle of spurs marking Bradley's careful advance. "Come out now, and maybe we can discuss this like civilized men," the sheriff called out, though his tone suggested anything but civilized intentions. Thomas knew he had 2 choices: surrender and hope for mercy he was unlikely to receive, or run and hope he could reach town before they caught him. He chose to run. The chase through the dense Oregon forest was a nightmare of branches tearing at his clothes, roots trying to trip him, and the growing sound of pursuit behind him. Thomas had always been quick on his feet, but these men knew the terrain better, and they were mounted. He almost made it to the road leading back to Cedar Falls when a rope settled around his shoulders, jerking him backward off his feet with brutal force. His head struck a rock as he fell, and stars exploded across his vision. "Well, well," Sheriff Bradley said, dismounting and walking over to where Thomas lay dazed and helpless. "If it isn't our quiet little surveyor. Been doing some surveying where you shouldn't, Thomas?" Thomas tried to speak, but his head was spinning from the impact. Blood trickled down the side of his face as he struggled to focus on the 4 men standing over him. "What do we do with him?" Judge Morrison asked nervously. "We can't just let him go, not after what he heard." "No," Bradley agreed, "we can't. But we can't exactly shoot him in cold blood either. Too many questions, too much attention." The thin man Thomas didn't recognize spoke up with a solution that made Thomas's blood freeze in his veins. "Fire," the man said simply. "Accidents happen all the time out here. Men get trapped in burning buildings, die trying to save their property. Very sad, but not suspicious." Bradley smiled at the suggestion, and Thomas realized he was looking at his own death sentence. "Perfect," the sheriff said. We'll put him in the old Henderson barn, make it look like he was trying to steal something, and got trapped when his lantern caught the hay. By the time anyone finds him, there won't be enough left to ask uncomfortable questions. As they bound his hands and threw him across a horse, Thomas caught sight of another figure watching from deeper in the forest. A young woman with dark hair and frightened eyes who had apparently witnessed everything just as he had. Sarah Jenkins, the schoolteacher who lived alone in a cabin near the woods, had obviously been in the wrong place at the wrong time just as Thomas had. And from the look in the sheriff's eyes when he spotted her, Thomas knew that their planned accident had just claimed a second victim. "Looks like we've got ourselves another witness to silence," Bradley said with grim satisfaction. As they rode toward what Thomas was certain would be his death, he found himself hoping that someone somewhere would be brave enough to stand up for the truth when morning came. He had no way of knowing that salvation would come from the most unexpected source, a poor widower farmer that most people in Cedar Falls had forgotten existed. Ezra Hawthorne heard the horses passing his small farm well after midnight, their hoofbeats muffled by the soft Oregon soil, but still loud enough to wake a man who had learned to sleep lightly since his wife Mary's death 2 years ago. At 53, Ezra had the weathered hands and stooped shoulders of a man who had spent his life working land that barely provided enough to survive on. His farm sat in a hollow between two ridges, isolated from the main road to Cedar Falls by nearly 3 miles of rough trail. It was poor land, mostly rocky soil that fought every attempt to coax crops from it, prone to flooding in the spring and drought in the summer. But it was his land, bought with money saved from 15 years of working other men's farms, and he would die before he gave it up. Most folks in Cedar Falls had forgotten Ezra existed. He came to town maybe once a month for supplies, spoke to no one unless spoken to first, and minded his own business with a dedication that had made him nearly invisible to his neighbors. The only person who had ever really seen him as more than just another failed farmer had been Mary, and she was gone now. Ezra pulled on his boots and stepped out onto the porch of his small log cabin, listening to the night sounds that told him something was wrong. The horses had passed heading toward the old Henderson place, but there had been urgency in their pace that spoke of trouble rather than honest travel. He was still standing there, trying to decide whether whatever was happening was any of his concern, when he saw the orange glow beginning to flicker against the low-hanging clouds to the northwest. Fire. In the dry Oregon autumn, fire was every farmer's nightmare. It could spread for miles with terrifying speed, consuming everything in its path: crops, buildings, livestock, and anyone unlucky enough to be caught in its way. But as Ezra watched, the glow didn't spread the way a wildfire would. It stayed localized, concentrated, like a building burning rather than grassland or forest. And it was coming from the direction of the old Henderson barn, the one that had been abandoned since Old Man Henderson died and his son moved the family to town. Ezra knew he should ignore it. Whatever was burning wasn't his concern, wasn't his property, wasn't his problem. He'd learned long ago that minding his own business was the safest way to live in a world that had little use for men like him. But Mary's voice echoed in his memory, as it often did during his loneliest moments. "Ezra Hawthorne, you may be the quietest man in Oregon Territory, but you've got more decency in your little finger than most men have in their whole bodies. Don't ever let the world make you forget that." Mary had always believed that good men had an obligation to act when they witnessed evil, regardless of the personal cost. It was one of the reasons he'd loved her, and one of the reasons her death had left such a hollow place in his chest. The glow was getting brighter. Ezra went back into the cabin and emerged with his old cavalry rifle, a memento from his service in the Union Army during the war between the states. He also grabbed his heavy coat, a coil of rope, and the short-handled axe he used for splitting kindling. His mare, Patience, nickered softly as he saddled her in the darkness. She was getting old, like her owner, but she was still steady and sure-footed on rough ground. "Come on, girl," Ezra whispered as he swung into the saddle. "Let's go see what kind of trouble somebody's gotten themselves into." The ride to the Henderson place took him 20 minutes through terrain that would have challenged a younger man on a better horse. But Ezra had hunted these hills for years, and Patience knew the trails as well as he did. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the Henderson farm, Ezra could see the full scope of what was happening below. The old barn was fully engulfed in flames, orange tongues licking high into the night sky and casting dancing shadows across the abandoned farmyard. But it wasn't the fire that made Ezra's breath catch in his throat. It was the sound coming from inside the burning building. Someone was screaming. Two people, from the sound of it, their voices raised in terror and desperation as the flames closed in around them. And standing in the farmyard, watching the barn burn with what looked like satisfaction, were four mounted figures that Ezra recognized even at a distance. Sheriff Bradley and three other men, making no effort to rescue whoever was trapped inside the inferno. In that moment, Ezra understood that he was witnessing not an accident, but a murder. And despite every instinct that told him to ride away and pretend he'd seen nothing, Mary's voice whispered in his ear once more. "Do what's right, Ezra. Do what's right, regardless of the cost." Ezra dismounted, checked his rifle, and started down the hill toward the burning barn. He was just one man against four, and those four included the sheriff himself. He had no authority, no backup, and no plan beyond doing what his conscience demanded. But sometimes that was enough. The heat hit Ezra like a physical wall as he approached the burning barn, the flames so intense they seemed to suck the oxygen out of the air itself. Through the roar of the fire, he could still hear the voices inside, weaker now but still fighting, still refusing to give up hope. The four men in the farmyard hadn't noticed his approach yet, their attention focused on watching their victims die. Ezra used the cover of an old equipment shed to get within 40 yards before Sheriff Bradley's horse shied and alerted the group to his presence. "Who's there?" Bradley called out, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "Show yourself." Ezra stepped out from behind the shed, his rifle held ready, but not yet aimed directly at any of the men. In the flickering light of the fire, he could see the shock on their faces as they recognized the poor farmer they'd all but forgotten existed. "Ezra Hawthorne," Bradley said with forced calm. "What are you doing here?" "Saw the fire from my place," Ezra replied, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "Came to help if I could." "Nothing to help with here," Judge Morrison said quickly. "Just an old barn burning down. Happens all the time with these abandoned buildings." "Funny thing," Ezra observed, never taking his eyes off the sheriff. "I can hear people screaming inside that barn. People who might need rescuing." The thin man Ezra didn't recognize laughed nervously. "That's just the sound the burning wood makes. Tricks the ear sometimes." But even as he spoke, a woman's voice rose above the flames, calling desperately for help. There was no mistaking it for anything but human terror. "Let them out," Ezra said quietly, his rifle shifting almost imperceptibly to cover the sheriff. Bradley's face hardened. "Ezra, you need to turn around and ride back to your little farm and forget you were ever here. This isn't your concern. It became my concern the moment I heard those screams." "You're outnumbered 4-1, the fourth man, someone Ezra now recognized as Carl Brennan, a wealthy rancher from the next valley, pointed out. "Even if you could take one of us, the others would cut you down." Ezra nodded calmly. "Probably true, but I'd make sure to take Sheriff Bradley first, and then you'd have to explain to the territorial authorities why you let a barn burn down with people inside while the sheriff lay dead in the yard." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Ezra could see the calculations running through each man's mind. How quickly they could draw, what the consequences would be if they killed him, whether they could afford to let him live knowing what he'd witnessed. But while they calculated, the barn continued to burn, and the screams from inside were getting weaker. "Time's running out," Ezra said. "For them, and for all of us. Let them go, Bradley. Whatever they know, whatever they've done, burning them alive won't solve your problems." "It'll solve them just fine," Bradley snarled, his patience finally snapping. His hand moved toward his gun. Ezra was faster than any of them expected. The rifle came up smoothly, trained directly on the sheriff's chest, and the distinctive sound of the hammer being cocked echoed across the farmyard. "Don't," Ezra said simply. But Bradley was already committed to his course of action, his own gun clearing leather with practiced speed. The other three men were drawing as well, and Ezra knew he had maybe 2 seconds before 4 weapons would be trained on him. He made a choice that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of firing at Bradley, Ezra swung his rifle toward the barn's main door and put a bullet through the heavy wooden bar that held it shut. The improvised lock splintered, and the door swung open under the pressure of the wind and heat. "Run!" Ezra shouted toward the opening, hoping the people inside were still conscious enough to hear him. 2 figures stumbled out of the smoke-filled barn, a man and a woman, both coughing violently and barely able to stand. Ezra recognized Thomas Mitchell, the surveyor, and Sarah Jenkins, the schoolteacher. Both looked like they'd been beaten before being tied up and left to die. The rescue attempt cost Ezra his tactical advantage. While he was focused on the barn door, Bradley and his men had all drawn their weapons and now had him dead to rights. "Should have minded your own business, Ezra," Bradley said, raising his pistol. But before he could fire, the barn's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber, creating a distraction that lasted just long enough for Ezra to dive behind a water trough. Bullets whined overhead as he scrambled for cover, trying to buy time for Thomas and Sarah to escape into the darkness. "Get to my horse," he called to them. "Ride for town. Tell everyone what you saw." But as he peered around the edge of the trough, Ezra realized that escape might not be possible for any of them. The 4 corrupt officials had spread out to surround his position, and the burning barn was lighting up the area like daylight. He was trapped, outnumbered, and facing men who had already proven they would kill to protect their secrets. But at least Thomas and Sarah were free. At least the truth had a chance to survive, even if he didn't. Sometimes, Ezra reflected as bullets continued to chip away at his meager cover. That had to be enough. The water trough that sheltered Ezra was old and made of wood, which meant it wouldn't stop bullets for long. Already he could see splinters flying as the 4 men closed in from different angles, their shots methodically destroying his cover. But Ezra had learned patience and tactics during his army days, and he wasn't going to waste ammunition on shots he couldn't make count. He waited until Judge Morrison moved too far from the cover of his horse, then put a bullet through the corrupt magistrate's shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. "Ezra!" Thomas Mitchell's voice came from somewhere in the darkness beyond the fire's glow. "We're not leaving you. Get out of here." Ezra shouted back, working the bolt on his rifle. "Tell the truth. That's all that matters now." But Thomas had apparently decided that running away wasn't an option. A rock thrown from the darkness struck Carl Brennan in the head, staggering the wealthy rancher and ruining his aim as he fired at Ezra's position. Sarah Jenkins appeared from another direction, having circled around behind the sheriff. She might have been a schoolteacher, but she'd grown up on a farm and knew how to handle herself in a crisis. The burning branch she swung at Bradley's back caught him completely by surprise, sending him sprawling and giving Ezra the chance to change positions. "You should have stayed hidden," Ezra called to them as he scrambled behind a broken wagon. "And let you face 4 armed men alone?" Sarah called back, "Mary Hawthorne would haunt me forever if I did that." The mention of his wife's name sent a surge of determination through Ezra's body. Mary had always believed that good people should stand together against evil, regardless of the odds. The thin man Ezra still didn't recognize had taken cover behind the well and was trying to get a clear shot at Thomas. Ezra couldn't let that happen. Thomas was the key witness, the one whose testimony would expose the entire conspiracy. Rising from behind the wagon, Ezra put himself in the open long enough to send a bullet into the well's stone coping just inches from the thin man's head. The ricochet sent rock chips flying, forcing the man to duck down and giving Thomas time to find better cover. But the move cost Ezra. Sheriff Bradley, recovering from Sarah's attack, had gotten around to a flanking position and now had a clear line of sight. "This is what happens to folks who don't mind their own business," Bradley snarled, raising his pistol. The shot that followed wasn't from Bradley's gun, but from somewhere in the darkness beyond the farmyard. The bullet took the corrupt sheriff high in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him next to the well. "Who else is out there?" Brennan called out nervously, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized they were facing more than just 3 isolated witnesses. The answer came in the form of approaching hoofbeats, not just 1 or 2 horses, but many. Someone had gotten word to Cedar Falls, and help was arriving. "This is Marshal Harrison, U.S. Territorial Marshal," called a strong voice from the approaching riders. "Lay down your weapons and surrender. Federal marshals. Someone with real authority, someone who couldn't be bought off or intimidated by local corruption." The thin man broke first, throwing down his gun and raising his hands. "I surrender. I was only following orders." Carl Brennan tried to run, but Thomas tackled him before he could reach his horse. The wealthy rancher fought like a man possessed, knowing that capture meant the exposure of all his illegal dealings, but the surveyor was younger and stronger. Judge Morrison, bleeding from his shoulder wound, simply sat down heavily and put his head in his hands. The fight had gone out of him completely. Sheriff Bradley was still alive but badly wounded, his gun lying several feet away where it had fallen. He looked up at Ezra with hatred and disbelief. "You've destroyed everything," he gasped. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've done what was right," Ezra replied simply. Marshal Harrison dismounted with 6 deputies, quickly taking control of the scene. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. "Mr. Mitchell sent word about corruption in Cedar Falls," the marshal said, looking around at the burning barn and the wounded conspirators. Looks like he wasn't exaggerating. Thomas and Sarah quickly filled in the details of what they'd witnessed. The midnight meeting, the forged documents, the plan to defraud local farmers, and the attempt to silence them permanently. "We have enough evidence to clean house from the sheriff's office all the way up to the territorial court," Marshal Harrison declared after examining the documents Thomas had seen them discussing. "This conspiracy involves land fraud on a massive scale." As dawn broke over the Oregon hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Ezra stood beside the smoking ruins of the Henderson barn and realized that his life had changed forever. He was no longer the forgotten farmer that everyone ignored. He was the man who had stood up to corruption when it mattered most. "Mr. Hawthorne," Marshal Harrison approached him as the prisoners were being loaded into wagons for transport to the territorial capital. "I'll need you to testify at the trial. Your actions last night saved not only 3 lives, but probably prevented dozens of farm families from being swindled out of their land." Ezra nodded. "I'll do whatever's needed." "There's something else," the marshal continued. "The territorial governor has been looking for men of character to serve as local law enforcement officers. If you're interested in the sheriff's position, I think the people of Cedar Falls would welcome an honest man for a change." The offer stunned Ezra. He'd never thought of himself as leadership material, never imagined that anyone would want him in a position of authority. But as he looked at Thomas and Sarah, 2 brave people who had risked their lives to expose the truth, he realized that maybe it was time to step out of the shadows and take on the responsibility of protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. "I'll consider it," he said finally. As the wagons carrying the corrupt officials rolled away toward justice, Ezra knew that Mary would have been proud of what he'd accomplished. He'd done what was right, regardless of the cost, and in doing so had found a new purpose for his life. The Old West was changing, slowly but surely, one act of courage at a time. 3 months after the night at the Henderson barn, Cedar Falls had transformed from a town living under the shadow of corruption to a community beginning to believe in justice again. The trial of the 4 conspirators had drawn attention from newspapers across the Oregon Territory, and the details of their fraud scheme had shocked even hardened frontier observers. Ezra Hawthorne sat behind the sheriff's desk in the newly cleaned and reorganized law office, still getting used to the weight of the badge on his chest and the respect in people's voices when they spoke to him. The transition from forgotten farmer to town sheriff had been challenging, but the same quiet determination that had sustained him through years of failed crops was serving him well in his new role. "Sheriff Hawthorne," Thomas Mitchell knocked on the door frame before entering. "The prosecutor wants to review my testimony one more time before the sentencing hearing tomorrow." Thomas had become the star witness in the case against the corruption ring, his detailed knowledge of the forged railroad documents providing the foundation for fraud charges that would send all 4 men to federal prison for decades. "How are you holding up?" Ezra asked, gesturing for Thomas to take a chair. "I know this hasn't been easy for you." Thomas smiled ruefully. "Better than I'd be if you hadn't come riding out of the darkness that night. Sarah and I owe you our lives." "You don't owe me anything," Ezra replied. "You 2 were the ones brave enough to witness what they were doing and willing to testify about it. All I did was make sure you survived to tell the truth." But Thomas shook his head. "It was more than that, Sheriff. You showed everyone in Cedar Falls that one person with courage can stand up to any amount of corruption. That matters more than you know." Through the office window, Ezra could see the changes his actions had set in motion. The Henderson farm, instead of being sold off to the conspirators for a fraction of its value, had been purchased at a fair price by a young family from California. The Morrison place was being worked by honest tenants who would eventually buy it from the judge's estate once his assets were liquidated to pay his legal fees. Sarah Jenkins had been promoted to head teacher for the entire district, partly in recognition of her bravery, but mostly because her experience had given her a maturity and authority that made her naturally suited for leadership. She'd also become a close friend to Ezra, often stopping by the sheriff's office to discuss cases and offer insights from her perspective as one of the few people in town who had witnessed the full scope of the conspiracy. "The territorial governor is sending a representative to the sentencing," Thomas informed him. "Word is they want to use our case as an example of how federal law enforcement can work with local communities to fight corruption." Ezra nodded, though he was still uncomfortable with the attention their story had attracted. "I hope it helps other communities that might be facing similar problems." The door opened again, and Sarah entered carrying a cup of coffee and a stack of papers. "The mail brought these," she said, setting the coffee on Ezra's desk. Letters from all over the territory, people thanking you for showing them that honest law enforcement is still possible. Ezra glanced through the letters with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. He'd never sought fame or recognition. All he'd done was what his conscience demanded. But he was beginning to understand that his actions had resonated far beyond Cedar Falls. There's one that might interest you particularly, Sarah said, pulling a formal-looking document from the stack. It's from the Oregon Territory Railroad Commission. They want you to serve as an advisor on preventing fraud in future development projects. The irony wasn't lost on Ezra. The same railroad survey work that had led to the conspiracy was now providing him with opportunities to use his experience to prevent similar schemes. What do you think? He asked Sarah and Thomas. Should a poor farmer turned sheriff be advising territorial commissions? I think, Sarah said firmly, that you're exactly the kind of person who should be advising them. You've seen what corruption looks like from the ground level, and you've proven you'll fight it regardless of the personal cost. Thomas nodded in agreement. The men who tried to defraud these farmers were counting on no one having the courage to stand up to them. They assumed that ordinary people would be too intimidated or too isolated to fight back. You proved them wrong. As the afternoon wore on and the business of being sheriff continued around them, Ezra reflected on how much his life had changed since that night when he'd heard horses passing his farm and seen the glow of fire on the horizon. Mary's voice had guided him into the flames that night, and her memory continued to guide him as he learned to use his new position to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. He was no longer the invisible farmer that everyone ignored. He was a symbol of the possibility that truth and justice could prevail, even against overwhelming odds. The sentencing hearing the next day would close one chapter of his story, but Ezra was beginning to understand that his real work was just beginning. There would be other conspiracies to uncover, other corrupt officials to face down, other people who needed someone willing to stand up for what was right. And for the first time since Mary's death, Ezra felt that he had found his purpose in life again. 2 years after the night that changed everything, Ezra Hawthorne rode into Cedar Falls on a crisp autumn morning, his territorial investigator's badge gleaming in the Oregon sunlight. The town had grown since his departure. New houses lined streets that had once been dusty paths, and the sound of construction echoed from the expanding business district. But it wasn't the physical changes that struck him most powerfully, it was the transformation in the people themselves. Where once he had seen citizens who kept their heads down and minded their own business, now he observed a community that stood tall with confidence and civic pride. Sheriff Hawthorne. The voice belonged to little Emma Morrison, who had been 7 when he left and was now a confident 9-year-old running toward him with a bright smile. You're back! Ezra dismounted and knelt to accept the child's enthusiastic hug, marveling at how much she had grown. Hello, Emma. How are your studies coming along? Miss Jenkins says I'm the best reader in my grade, Emma announced proudly. She tells us stories about the night you saved those people from the fire, about how one brave person can change everything. Sarah Jenkins approached from the direction of the new schoolhouse, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing her old friend. Ezra, we got your telegram that you'd be visiting, but I didn't expect you so early. Finished my business in Portland ahead of schedule, Ezra replied, standing to embrace Sarah warmly. How are things here? See for yourself, Sarah said, gesturing toward the bustling main street. The Henderson farm is producing the best wheat crop in the valley. The Morrison place has been turned into a model dairy operation, and the town council just voted to build a new courthouse with a dedication to honest law enforcement. As they walked through town, Ezra was amazed by what he saw. Thomas Mitchell had used his surveying skills and his newfound local fame to establish a thriving engineering firm, helping other small communities plan sustainable development. The man who had once been just a quiet observer had become a leader in his own right. There's something else you should see, Sarah said, leading him toward the old Henderson place. What had once been a struggling farm was now a prosperous operation, but that wasn't what caught Ezra's attention. In the spot where the old barn had burned down, the community had erected a monument, a simple stone marker surrounded by a beautiful garden. The inscription read, "In memory of those who died for truth, and in honor of those who lived to tell it. October 15th, 1888. Sometimes one person with courage is enough to change the world." The whole community contributed to this, Sarah explained quietly. Farmers, merchants, even families from other towns who heard about what happened here. They wanted to make sure the lesson was never forgotten. Thomas Mitchell emerged from the farmhouse, no longer the nervous surveyor Ezra remembered, but a confident man whose bearing spoke of someone who had found his purpose in life. "Ezra," Thomas called out warmly. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing the next phase of the memorial project." "Next phase?" Ezra asked. "A training center," Thomas explained excitedly. "A place where law enforcement officers from across the territory can come to learn about investigating corruption and protecting citizens' rights. We want to call it the Hawthorne Institute for Justice." Ezra felt overwhelmed by the honor they were proposing, but also uncertain about having his name attached to such a grand project. "Thomas, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not sure I'm the right person to have an institute named after me." "You're exactly the right person," Sarah said firmly. "Do you know what's happened since your story spread throughout Oregon Territory?" She proceeded to tell him about the wave of reforms his actions had inspired. 12 corrupt officials had been removed from office in communities across the territory. Citizens who had never before challenged authority were organizing to demand accountability from their leaders. The territorial government had established new oversight procedures specifically designed to prevent the kind of conspiracy they had uncovered in Cedar Falls. "But more than that," Thomas added, "you've given people hope. You've shown them that ordinary citizens can stand up to corruption, no matter how powerful or intimidating it might seem." As the afternoon progressed, more and more people sought out Ezra to share their stories of how his example had influenced their own actions. The baker told him about exposing price-fixing among local merchants. The postmaster described how he had reported a territorial official for stealing mail. Even young Emma Morrison proudly announced that she had stood up to a classroom bully, inspired by Sheriff Hawthorne's courage. That evening, the entire community gathered for a celebration dinner in Ezra's honor. As he looked around at the faces surrounding him, people he had saved, people he had inspired, people who had found their own courage to make their world better, Ezra realized that his actions on that October night had created something far greater than he had ever imagined. "Friends," he said when called upon to speak, "when I rode out to that burning barn 2 years ago, I thought I was just trying to save 2 people from dying. I never dreamed that one night of doing what was right could have such far-reaching consequences." The crowd listened intently as he continued. "But I've learned something important during my travels as a territorial investigator. The courage to stand up for what's right isn't rare, it exists in all of us. What's rare is the willingness to act on that courage when it matters most." He paused, looking directly at Sarah and Thomas, the 2 people whose own courage had made everything else possible. "The real heroes of that night weren't the man with the rifle," Ezra said. "They were the witnesses who refused to stay silent, even when silence would have been safer. They were the people who chose truth over comfort, justice over convenience." As the celebration continued around him, Ezra felt Mary's presence more strongly than he had since her death. She would have been proud not just of what he had accomplished, but of what his actions had inspired in others. The next morning, before leaving Cedar Falls to continue his territorial duties, Ezra stood once more beside the memorial where the old Henderson barn had burned. The inscription spoke of courage changing the world, but Ezra now understood that the real change came not from one moment of heroism, but from the countless daily choices that people made to do what was right. His legacy wasn't the monument or the proposed institute or even the corrupt officials he had helped bring to justice. His legacy was the understanding that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose to use it in service of truth and justice. As he rode away from Cedar Falls toward his next assignment, Ezra carried with him the knowledge that the work he and Mary had begun together, the work of standing up for what was right, would continue long after he was gone. It would continue in the hearts and actions of everyone who had learned that sometimes one person with courage really is enough to change the world. The flames that had threatened to destroy truth that October night had instead forged something stronger, a community of people committed to ensuring that justice would always find a way to prevail.